Welcome to the XY Advisor podcast. To join a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice, head to xyadvisor.com. This episode is proudly sponsored by Integrity Life. Just like XY Advisor, Integrity isn't afraid to ask the hard questions, like why does quoting life insurance have to be so darn complicated? Why can't you just do it all online? Why can't underwriting be more consistent? And why can't claiming be just that little bit easier? To find out how Integrity is doing all these things differently and more, head to integritylife.com.au/XY. G'day, Clayton here from XY, chatting with Michael. Mate, thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, actually. Your name always is next to some of the most valuable contributions on XY, has been for many, 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 many years. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that you're actually writing the textbook. You don't get to say this very often, but you're actually writing the book, the textbook on ethics and financial planning, along with Dr. Michelle Carl, along with Chilla, and others. That's a pretty exciting project to be a part of. How did you sort of come across that?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And look, we don't know, but we do think it will be the only book in the market, at least at this stage. For that, we're sort of aiming to have a lot of that completed around the end of this year. Look, it largely just sort of came about by, I'd met in particular Dr. Carl a couple of years ago, I think at one of the FPA conferences, and sort of contacted her and said, well, it doesn't look like anybody else is doing this. We've got some experience and that we can add to this, so let's do it. I'd done one text with LexisNexis, the publishers, previously, which was sort of quite specifically focused at solicitors and lawyers and barristers. And then Dr. Carl's contributed to other texts as well with them in the past. So we just put together a bit of we think this is what it could look like, and took it to them. And we were fortunate enough that they said yes.
That's fantastic. It is an interesting topic, ethics in financial planning. Do you think ethics in financial planning is different to ethics in any other profession?
I don't think it is, but part of the focus of the text, and this is why we've sort of gone with that ethics and professional practice is, and there has been a lot of movement, obviously, with the FASEA, the Code of Ethics coming in and the like there, but it does all play into that system of professional practice, a lot of which already existed. The financial services reform, and then FOFA, and then your different sort of disciplinary and client restitution bodies. You have the ethical requirements, and a lot of, particularly what Dr. Carl focuses on in the text is that very sort of wider context and methodologies. But that also then has to be related to, well, what are the rules, the systems and things like that exist within financial planning.
Yeah. It's a strange concept to have to codify or at least put into a level of regulation and to some extent legislation, an ethical framework, considering ethics are rather ethereal in nature. It's doing good. It's always sort of, I love what it's trying to achieve, but it's always a little bit, and I learned this during the FPA's ethics course, their first subject in the CFP. And that is, there are different frameworks for what someone considers ethical. And I always like the example that always comes to my mind is utilitarianism versus deontology, which is, what's good because it's good, or what's the best thing for the most amount of people. And those two things can can sometimes be polar opposites. And so to codify ethics, it's a difficult thing to do. And it's not really something that you see in, like, so for example, I know that doctors have the Hippocratic Oath, and that's essentially been around for a long time. And that's them saying, I'm going to do everything in my power to keep everyone around me alive for as long as humanly possible. But it doesn't really get too much more complicated than that, like it's a kind of a simple thing. In financial planning, however, because there is so much, I guess, complexities in terms of conflicts in remuneration and business models, and supporting business models, and parallel sort of professions, mortgage brokering, and everything that I guess financial planning feeds into, that we've got a really large, in fact, a whole body now that's been created and a whole code. And that's really, it's very different to what else is out there. Do you think that this was the only way to achieve improvements in quote unquote ethics in financial planning, or do you think there's another way? Or I guess the question is the solution that we've chosen to do you think it is kind of inevitable, or would there be anything else out there?
I think, to be honest, Clayton, I probably haven't given that much thought to that. And the reason for that is we have the system that is there now. So that's, and I think I apply this in my practice a lot. Why does this tax law or this particular social security law actually exist? It's interesting to consider and the like there, but actually, what we need to do, there are efforts we can go to with lobbying and things like that if we believe the system could be improved. But today we need to work in the system that we have. So that's probably where most of my thought has gone. And when you sort of go through this process and what's in the text is, there's very rarely the situation where somebody throws the entire existing system out and starts fresh. What you actually sort of get is these changes and additions over time, and we've certainly seen that in financial planning, that what you then need to figure out is, well, how do these different parts go together? Mm-hmm. So that's probably more of the focus is what we have got, how do we put that together? How do we actually know what the different components are? Because I actually think that's a big step in itself. That there isn't great awareness. I know at times in writing the text, I've been sitting there thinking, this feels like I'm just telling people to suck eggs. The different sort of parts of the Corps Act on what has to go in an SOA, and what your sort of best interest duties are, and then if you're a member of one of the professional associations, that they have their own sort of code of conduct, and so you do have this moment if you're writing it all down, you think, God, is this actually useful to anybody? But I think then if you sort of step back and look at sort of the two audiences there, is actually largely, if we're sitting there in practice, even through the existing training most of us have sort of had, there hasn't been anything which really sort of sits down and says, actually, here are all the different systems. You sort of you pick it up a bit here and there. You get some bits from a professional development day. You get another bit from a briefing from a compliance section. Now, a lot of the sort of the work that I've done with sort of disciplinary bodies and panels and things like that, I've certainly picked up a lot of it, but you do realise that, even if you are an existing practitioner, nobody has really sat down and said, this is the whole system. So I do think that has some value for people who are already existing practitioners. Yes. And certainly, it's a fair while now since I was a student not knowing what financial planning was. But there's a point in time, and there will be people going through these courses who don't know what that system is. So there are some very serious implications in the standards that you're sort of agreeing to uphold and things like that. That it's actually pretty important to know what you're doing and what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, no, it goes without saying. Everyone is interested in improving advice, and I think that this is it's an important step in really taking financial planning to the level that it needs to be. I think something I probably say it too much, but financial advice is too important not to do well. And so, I'm a big fan of this. I always like to maybe just consider the why, but I think you're probably right. That's maybe being a little bit too philosophical about it. It's probably more interesting knowing exactly what the situation is right now. So it's a great thing that you're a part of doing there. You mentioned there was a time when you were a student, you didn't know what financial planning was. I'm kind of interested. How did you get into financial advice? Like, did you study it at university, or what's the story?
Yeah, I definitely didn't study financial advice at university because I know that I actually at one point went to my university and said, well, at the time was, is this course, it's now RG 146, but it was back then it was PS, which I think was for Policy Statement 146. I said, look, is the course compliant? And they said, PS what? The way I sort of got into this is I was doing a commerce degree at university. It's effectively a banking degree, which was quite handy as it turns out in the global financial crisis, which was very banking related. And I saw a job ad for a paraplanner. And I distinctly remember thinking, what's a paraplanner? I must have done some Googling then, because I somehow got from there to, I'm definitely qualified for that job. I better submit an application. I did actually get an interview. I think it was all very quick because I can remember being called and they said, can you come in this afternoon? I said, I can. I am dressed for university, not for a job application. They said, don't worry about that, come in. They didn't give me the job. They did give it to somebody who knew what it was the day before. But the practitioner there, a fellow called Philip Bash, was actually very generous with his time and sort of explained what it all was, what they did.
Wow.
I think it was about a 45-minute to an hour interview, which was very generous for a fellow who probably had worked out 5 minutes in that I wasn't going to be the successful applicant. And that was actually there where I said, okay, look, I was sort of doing this degree and I was working and studying part-time. I knew I was interested in numbers and money sort of stuff, but that was about as much direction as it had. But it was actually that sort of interview where I thought, okay, this sounds really good. This is what I want to get into. So then started sort of channeling, all those efforts. And I was working in the Commonwealth Public Service at the time, started applying for jobs as a bit of a sort of transition there with the body that looks after all the public sector and the military defined benefit superannuation scheme. So that was where I sort of thought, okay, this is where I'm going to sort of push this.
Wow. So did you say you were working in a sector like for the government that dealt with the defined benefits?
That's where I sort of went to. When I first started, I was working just for a Department of Defence, just paying bills and stuff like that. Finance related, but very really quite basic.
Right.
But not specifically in financial planning. But when I sort of thought, okay, well, now I know what this is and I want to sort of get towards that, I thought, well, a logical step is I can stay in government for a while, but move into this role where it's looking specifically at superannuation. And that was, at that stage, that was before they had any of the other, they now have modern accumulation type schemes, but it was all, It was actually all defined benefit then. So moved over to there.
The Australian Defence Force defined benefit is one of, now they're all crazy, but that's one of the more crazier ones from memory. For about almost 12 months, I worked a lot with defined benefits, and I actually find them quite intellectually stimulating because of how ridiculous and complicated for no reason that they are, and the amount of sort of competing and overlapping rules that they just have internally for seemingly nonsensical reasons. And but just knowing that these things exist, like that hilarious 54 or 5311 or whatever, that strategy with the CSS and things like that. Like if you retire 1 month before you're meant to, you know, you get these extra things, and it's all I remember it being quite, it was intellectually stimulating. So you've gone into financial planning, and then with a strong tilt towards defined benefits?
Yeah, that's where my first experience was, and my role was largely, on the phones in their sort of call center. So it was a fantastic way to start.
Oh yeah,
because you learn really, really quickly when people are calling up with these questions.
Yes.
And I think one skill that you pick up that has worked, has really sort of carried through, is the answer of, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Yeah.
Because especially in defined benefits, and especially when you're new, but you never know every answer off the top of your head.
Oh yeah.
What you can do is you can find the answer, and hopefully, particularly for those ones that come up quite regularly, you start to store a lot of that away. I can tell you to this day that I think it was in about 2005, but $129,751 was the amount of the old, what's now become the taxable tax component that you could withdraw before you paid tax, because I answered that question every day for a year. That funny things like that stick.
Yes.
But yeah, I'll never forget that one.
That is so funny. Awesome. Yeah. So obviously, like, coming at advice from this, I guess, strong technical background. So how did you make that transition? Did you then ever end up working as a paraplanner, or what was the journey into becoming an advisor?
Yeah, absolutely. I was definitely there, enjoying the work I did, but always wanted to get into financial planning. I think that they had people who actually sort of went out and did presentations and seminars to the members of those schemes, but that often sort of involved liaising with financial planners. So I do know there was one of the presentation team was sort of going out and meeting with somebody local, and I said, I'm coming with you, thanks.
Yeah.
And I think I strongly expressed my desire to move into the sector, and picked up a role that way. So.
That's sensational. So paraplanner first, or straight into financial planning?
My first job was paraplanning almost exclusively, and then sort of moved into another role after a couple of years, which I think a lot of people have had probably similar career moves. On day one, it was probably 99% paraplanning and 1% financial planning, and that ratio just shifted over time effectively.
Mate, that's so cool. Yeah. When you started in financial advice as a paraplanner, were the people that you worked with, were they clear on the journey on how to become a financial planner, or was it just simply you're a paraplanner and then that's kind of the job and it doesn't ever change? Because how to become a financial planner, it's a little bit different now because the professional year is here. So there's now a little bit of a codified journey. But before the professional year existed, it was really like, put your tongue on your finger and hold your finger up in the air, like how do I do this kind of thing? What were you given like a bit of a clear path into the financial planner role, or was it something that you had to leave the company to do, or how did that work?
I've always worked for comparatively quite small firms, so there was never a sort of defined path or anything like that. But I think also with the small firms, I think largely from day one, I was pretty, I would attend meetings, and I wasn't just expected to sit in the corner and not say anything. It was expected that I would sort of contribute to those. So I think you did a lot of that. And then really the transition in the role where I sort of really did move much more into financial planning and less paraplanning was because just within that firm, people who were in full-time advice roles left. There was people who then needed to be looked after, and I was fortunate enough to have been given that opportunity, and then competent enough to not mess up the opportunity, and it just sort of went from there.
Very cool. Very cool. And so how long now have you been in financial advice, including paraplanning?
Yeah, so the whole lot's probably 15 or 16 years now. Wow. I think because the way it was set up with those defined benefit super schemes, we were authorised representatives, so you can go on the financial advisor register and see when I was first authorised, which was only a couple of months after I started in that. So it actually it's a pretty well kept record.
Right, no, fair enough. And so you've obviously got your own company now, and you've recently gone through a licensee change about 6 months ago. Can you walk us through what that was like? I guess the most important question here is, how did you choose your new license? Because one of the things that we're sitting around thinking about at XY is, how do we give some clarity to that question? Like, we would love to help. We just don't really know what to do. So how did you make the decision on where you wanted to move?
I'm probably a terrible example for that, Clayton, but because it was just a case that the licensing and franchising arrangements that I had were shutting down. And so I was looking at alternatives, and I've joined a licensee called Wealth Market. And I was talking to them because I knew some of the people involved, and it was very people-driven. They were people that I'd worked with in the past, and they were now involved with Wealth Market. So I sort of went along, and their head office is in Sydney. I'm here in Canberra, so virtually met with the CEO, Matt, and he sort of outlined a lot of their approach. They're very, in particular, technology sort of hungry and focused about how we can use that to improve client service and run efficient practices. So that was my one assessment of a potential new licensee. I said, I know a lot of the people in the background. I like what you're saying about how you're running it. Yeah, excellent. Let's get it done. So that has worked out very well for me. That probably doesn't give you much of a sort of a process there for
replicating it as a framework. Yeah.
Well, and it is. I can see now, particularly having been through it, how really difficult it would be to evaluate that if you didn't have that. I was relying entirely on, I know who some of the key people involved are, and I trust them and what they're trying to build, and so I'm going to go with that.
Yes.
Now, if you're just evaluating somebody you saw on LinkedIn or somebody on XY said you should talk to these people, that's a much harder job.
Yes, yeah, it is. And yet you get huge amount of licensee changes. Like, depending on how, the trend has obviously been over quite a while now is to move into smaller or self-license. That's just been the trend over quite a number of years. But obviously with IOOF, purchasing, a bunch of purchases. They're now essentially the largest financial services company in Australia. They obviously have a different view. They're obviously thinking that it's going to turn back the other way. Who knows? I certainly don't know. But though I think the questions on how to choose a license is a question that needs help solving, I think, till there's no more licenses. I think there's always going to be people looking for new licenses. And I think, we're stuck on a challenge that we would like to solve, and we really would like to solve that. So who knows, we might come up with something. Now, in regards to the work that you do with the FPA, actually, before I get to that, do you know the PIFA guys by any chance? Because I know that they're Canberra based.
No, I sort of know of them. I do know that their sort of president is runs his practice here in Canberra. I did listen to the podcast that you did with him, but no, I actually haven't sort of come across Daniel in person. Which, I mean, Canberra is a small place, and Canberra financial planning, a lot of us know each other. Yes. So it is somewhat of a surprise, but no, I haven't yet.
Wow, that is a surprise. Yeah. Because obviously, like with your and I see it on XY, the platform itself, like your technical expertise. I mean, you're just consistently well and truly up the top there with the most highly regarded people in terms of the answers to the questions that you provide. And obviously, you're a very technically minded advisor. When I was speaking to Daniel from PIF, I was thinking maybe that there would be an association there. Sorry, that's probably the wrong word to use. Maybe there's an existing a friendship or relationship there because of how small financial planning in ACT is in Canberra is. So who knows? We might be able to put an event on and get down there. But you are doing work with, you have done some work with the FPA, with the conduct reviews and things like that. What do you see as a challenge for financial planners in terms of, what are some common mistakes do you think financial planners do make in their conduct, so to speak?
That's a really good question. I think there's a particular sort of case. This wasn't one of the financial planning ones that sort of springs to mind, and it was where there had ended up being a complaint. There was advice provided in relation to a self-managed super fund, a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, and a property. All I think quite high risk areas of advice. They're just when you've got leverage involved, when you've got all the technicalities of a self-managed super fund. And in this case, there was no file note made of the meeting where the advice was presented to the client. So I do think that there are a lot of disputes and the like that come down to a failure of process as much as somebody necessarily intending to give really poor conflicted advice. There's also part of writing the book is I've read through all of the AFCA decisions for the last 2 financial years as they relate to advice.
Wow.
Really riveting stuff. I do actually find it interesting. I'm aware that's probably not that commonly held a view. But for example, one of the sort of types of cases that you saw in these disputes, and it's something that I think most practitioners would be quite familiar with, is where you might have seen a couple who were not necessarily right at retirement age, but maybe sort of 45 to 50. And they still had a reasonable whack of debt in terms of mortgages, maybe on investment properties and things like that, and not an overwhelming amount of super. And in particular, they were talking about insurance. And I think every practitioner knows that, particularly at that when somebody is at that age, there's not that much of an opportunity to lock in really low cost level premiums. So you start getting into this pretty difficult compromise and trade-off between, well, how much cover do I need, to provide for kids, to cover mortgages, things like that, real need that exists for insurance, versus what are the resources that I have available to pay for that.
Yes.
And then particularly when it comes to using super, what's that trade-off between getting myself insurance I need and the impact that then has on my retirement.
Yes.
That's something that I think every practitioner who's been doing this for a while will have worked with somebody where there are some really difficult trade-offs and decisions to be made.
Yeah.
And what you see in those disputes is, 6, 7, and 8 years after the fact that's when people start saying, well, hold on, I'm not sure that we got this right. And that's where you get a huge variation in how well those trade-offs and discussions were had with the client, but also documented in a way that it becomes, that it is obvious to somebody who is looking at this many years later, that they can then sort of recreate, well, what did happen here?
Yes.
And that's where you see ones where there's just very, very little documentation. And it becomes very difficult, you can imagine, for somebody to then say, no, look, we did have all these really tough discussions. They really wanted the insurance. Ultimately, it comes down to, well, how can we prove that? How can we see what sort of clues are that might have happened? And often the answer is there's very little.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you would occasionally see one of these disputes where the practitioner had done an outstanding job and the systems were there of capturing that real genuine financial planning discussion of, client, I'm applying my expertise here to tell you, what insurance costs, the sorts of things you need. What we can see here is that you have some really difficult trade-offs to make, and let's work together using my knowledge, my training, but also your personal values and decisions to come to that point where we submit an application saying, give me this much life insurance. There are examples out there where that has been really well done, and that you then have a dispute where somebody is looking at that and saying, no, the situation that has occurred was reasonable advice about a hard decision. That's I think one of the real sort of key distinctions there is, and once again, that comes a little bit down to what is the practitioner's sort of knowledge and the thought that they've given to that, but also it's what are the systems that either they'd set up for themselves or a licensee may have provided for them.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. So process is a typical conduct problem. So let actually on that, and I think it's a really good example of the client coming back, say almost a decade later, and saying the impact to my superannuation was larger than I anticipated. I received, I received protection during that time, but nothing tangible. And so I feel like I've been ripped off. What's the best, well, maybe not even the best, but what's a really good way to capture that? Like, is there a table that can be used, or is it just simply qualitative? Is it a recorded conversation? Like, to your mind, what is the best, what's the best practice with making sure your process is really good?
Well, I think you've probably touched on two things there, because the first thing is the conversation actually has to happen.
Oh God, yes.
And I know that seems obvious, but actually one of the things that's really easy for us to lose sight of is all of those little subconscious thoughts that we go through in making an assessment and a recommendation, and they're quite second nature and the like to us, because this is what we do in the space that we live in all day, every day.
Yeah.
So one of the things we do actually need to remind ourselves is to talk to the client about that, because it's actually quite easy to really skip over and gloss over things because you are experienced. And once again, if you then imagine, you might have thought about a lot of things, and then if you think about a person, a client sitting there saying, well, you never told me that. And that's where I think that first part is, that might be a function of, you do have to, you should tell them, and you should have those conversations with them. And that might not be malintent that sort of leads you to not having it. It's just because it seems small to us because we're good at it and because we know it. But once again, this is the first time that client has probably approached that situation. It might be the 100th for us. So there is that first step of actually having it and doing it, remembering that these things are substantial, and also that the client has a role and has a say. But they need to be informed. I think then that question of, well, what do you use to capture it? I think any of the methods you've really spoken of can work. I think when you're communicating it, you want to be doing it in a way that resonates with the client themselves. You can sort of capture that any old way, but I think there's probably an element too of applying that professional judgment to say what are the big things and really the really important decisions and considerations that I need to draw out of what is inevitably a very large piece of advice. And I'm not just talking about the length of a statement of advice, but most of the time when we're giving advice to somebody, we cover a lot of ground. Yeah. And then part of it is saying, well, okay, what are the 2, 3, the 5, the really big things, decisions, or even the assumptions that could affect whether or not this goes well or not, and how have I then brought that to the fore? Made sure that they're really aware that this is an important part of it.
Yeah, which is, such a huge part of financial planning is making sure someone is comfortable and is receiving value, but realistically, it's getting these conversations correct that is it makes financial advice at the end of the day. Like that being able to have those conversations and helping your client make the right decision there is ultimately what you're getting paid for. So making sure you're having those conversations and doing it correctly, I think it's a really good point. Yeah, like I do sort of gloss over that, but you're exactly right. Like make sure you're spending the time having those basic conversations multiple times a day with everyone, because don't skip over it in your head. And that's a really good point. And you go back to the great gentleman that introduced you to financial planning, spending his time teaching you that's a sign of a great advisor, someone who's just sitting down and explaining what the role in the job is. Whereas he could have just said, you're not right, after 5 minutes. But yeah, it's a very good attribute of a good financial planner. And sort of just to, wrap up with the work that you do, it's very technical minded and you've got a finger on a pulse, I think, substantially more than many advisors just because of how proactive you are in this space. What do you see for the next 12 months and maybe 5 years in terms of advice? Are you bullish or do you see more problems on the horizon, or where are you sitting at as an industry as a whole?
I think the ultimate positive factor is that the need for assistance is there, and it's going to continue to be there. If we look at somebody's superannuation in isolation, that might be a little bit simple. But you ultimately end up looking at their superannuation and how that relates to their insurance and maybe their age pension, and then you start to bring the family dynamics into it. When you start to stack a couple of otherwise simple things together, it becomes complicated, and there are people out there that need that assistance. We're obviously seeing a drop in the number of advisors, so that is going to mean that on a per advisor basis, there are more people that want their help. I don't think financial planning is going away. Everybody then needs to be running a practice that is paying them fairly for the work that they're doing. There is challenges around doing that in general, and then people who might have to transition from a business model that used to work to a new one. So I wouldn't downplay that, but you only have to look in media and talk to people and realise that people really want help. They've got other things that they want to do with their lives. They're not actually all that interested in the definition of assets in the Social Security Act. I don't know why it's fascinating, but that's here to stay.
100%, mate. Well, very good. Well, look, it's something that I've been looking forward to, is having you on this podcast for a while, mate. And so thank you really for spending the time just to talk us through. It's always interesting when you see someone on the platform, but you get to chat to them face to face like this. So it's been a pleasure, mate. Thank you.
No, that's all right. And I will slip in one plug very quickly.
Please.
You can pre-register if you'd like to hear when the book is available. You just need to go to michaelmiller.help/book. You can put in your details there, and when it is available, we'll let you know. I don't know what process there is for signed copies, and I don't know if there's much desire either. But flick me an email if that's something you really want. And otherwise, I'll get back to writing. It's pretty close, but it's not done yet.
Oh, very awesome. No, we'll make sure we include the link in the podcast notes as well. So, mate, thank you very, very much for coming on.
No worries. Thanks, Clayton.
Cheers.